Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to talk about the end of World War II and the beginning of something called the Cold War. And to get this conversation started, we're going to take a look at a short little video excerpt, and I'd like you to see if you can figure out what the heck is going on here.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
A cloud hides the sky. A nuclear shadow falls across the human future. Midway through the 20th century, two superpowers prepared for a conflict which might have ended life on the planet. Spring flowers, the warm light of day, the pleasures of life. But under this American hotel was a hidden gate. It led into an underworld. This was the shelter for members of the United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. Down here, the politicians would represent the dead and the dying in the world overhead. For a handful of human beings, there was all they needed to wait out the nuclear winter. But nerves might snap, then order would be kept by force. The lost world above the shelter would become only a memory, a myth. The living would come to envy the dead.
So, as you saw in the film, there was a secret underground facility for members of Congress in the event of a nuclear war. It was located under a hotel called the Greenbrier in West Virginia. But why was this necessary? We're going to look at this story today of why the Soviet Union and the United States went at it for over 45 years in something called the Cold War. And to start off this conversation, let's define the term Cold War. This was a global conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. It lasted from 1946 to 1991. And every time I teach about the Cold War, a big question students tend to have is, why was it called the Cold War? Sometimes I get the answer that it was because temperatures dropped during this time period. This was not the case. If anything, due to global carbon emissions, temperatures were starting to rise beginning in the mid-20th century. Another answer I get is that they say, well, there wasn't really a war. Nobody got killed. And this is the greatest misconception people have about the Cold War. In fact, the Cold War consisted of many proxy wars. That means the Soviet Union and the United States were supporting soldiers who were fighting each other in different places in wars like Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, parts of Africa, Latin America. Millions of people died in these conflicts. So it is definitely incorrect to say that nobody was fighting, nobody died during the Cold War, which leaves us with the third option here. The United States and the Soviet Union never pulled out all the stops using the full capabilities of their nuclear arsenals. This never turned into a hot war, which would have been a nuclear war. And if it had, the world we're living in today would look very different. Now we're going to look at some of the origins of the Cold War today, and a big question for us, did we have to have a Cold War? What was all of the conflict about? A lot of it has to do with these two conflicting ideologies, communism and capitalism. And the roots of this conflict go back to 1917 and the Russian Revolution, when the Tsar was overthrown in Russia and replaced with a communist dictatorship led by Vladimir Lenin and later someone named Joseph Stalin. One thing we want to try to understand here is the differences between these two different ideologies. Capitalism is a system which thrives on private ownership. In a capitalist economy, it's possible to have extreme inequalities between the wealthy and the working class. Communism tries to level the playing field. It says that the means of production should be owned by workers and that wealth should be distributed equally. Now, the problem with communism for Americans and others was that communist societies historically have been dictatorships which have deprived people of personal freedoms. And this was certainly the case in the Soviet Union. Under Joseph Stalin, the government controlled all aspects of the economy. There was a secret police which could execute people without any due process. The media was completely controlled by the state, and there was a system of prison and labor camps called the Gulag. You could be sent to one of these camps where it was very likely you would never survive. There's a word for all of this, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's called totalitarianism. So while communism had very lofty aims, and for many people under certain circumstances represented a better alternative than capitalism, which remember the 1930s was really considered a great failure, communism as it had evolved by the mid-20th century was associated with dictatorship and the curtailing of personal freedoms. Now, interestingly, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies against the Nazis. But it was always an uneasy alliance, and there was a long history of suspicion going back to that 1917 revolution. In fact, during the Russian Civil War in 1918, the United States had sent troops who fought against the Bolsheviks, and the Russians remembered this history. It was part of their propaganda. And in 1919 in the United States, there was what we call the Red Scare. Americans were freaking out about the possibility of communists taking over the American government, spreading their ideas within the United States. So this history of tension between these two ideologies went back decades. Now, at the end of World War II, there were a lot of questions about what was going to happen to the lands that Germany had occupied during the war. It was the Soviet Union that reached Berlin first, and now all of the lands east of this point were occupied by the Red Army. The big question was the Soviet Union going to establish a sphere of influence over this territory? This was a huge question that was raised at the post-war conference known as Yalta. Now, I'd like you to read this section here. It says, Betrayal at Yalta. And answer question 6. What promise did Stalin make at the Yalta Conference that he later failed to honor? So at Yalta, Joseph Stalin had promised that the people of Eastern Europe would have the ability to choose their own governments. That is not what happened. In 1946, Britain's former Prime Minister Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and gave a very famous speech, which is considered the beginning of the Cold War. We're going to take a moment and listen to what he had to say, and then in question 7, I'm going to ask you to answer, what warning did Winston Churchill give to Americans in his famous speech?
Fulton, Missouri, a quiet little town in the Midwest. Not much has changed since 1946. Less than a year since the war had ended, the flags were up to welcome Winston Churchill. But he came to Fulton bringing a somber message for the world.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
So as you just heard in this speech, Winston Churchill spoke of something called an Iron Curtain. And what he's referring to is basically this line dividing the communist-controlled Eastern Europe and the non-communist Western Europe. And Churchill says, behind this line, people have no freedoms. And essentially, in this speech, Churchill is saying, hey, America, we took care of Hitler, now we've got a new problem. If you don't stop Joseph Stalin, communism is going to be the new Nazism. So this is considered the opening shot of the Cold War. Now I'm going to ask you guys in the last question there, using specific evidence from the video and the reading, do you think that a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was inevitable? Did we have to have a Cold War?
I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. When we come back here on Wednesday, we're going to take a look at the steps the United States took to contain the spread of communism throughout the Cold War. Until then, I hope you guys are doing your best to stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you soon.